I'm Emily Rooney. Welcome to Beat the Press. Our topics: 2 weeks of nonstop marathon coverage, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Photographers and reporters putting themselves in harm's way. Should the media debunk conspiracy theories or ignore them? And our panel rants and raves of the week. Joining me are Dan Kennedy of Northeastern University, WGBH's Callie Crossley, Philip Martin, also of WGBH, and Tom Fiedler of Boston University. First, news organizations have been covering the marathon bombings virtually around the clock for the past 2 weeks. A lot of that coverage has been outstanding. But as with any breaking news story, there's often a combination of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Starting with the good. The finish line bombings took place during the most photographed and reported annual event of the year. Radio and TV stations had their A-teams in place.
We were looking in that direction right when that bomb went off.
And it continued. Local stations went virtually round the clock from Monday afternoon through Saturday morning.
Also, suspect number one was interviewed by the FBI back in 2011.
And a special acknowledgement to Boston Globe videographer Steve Silva, who captured this video in the thick of a chaotic situation. And veteran Globe still photog John Tulmacki, who took this shot. Also outstanding, the Boston Globe, which has outdone itself since Marathon Day. And keeping an even keel as things were breaking, NBC's Pete Williams, who insisted there were no suspects yet, despite reports to the contrary.
Well, if we have information, an arrest has been made. I was told by a Boston law enforcement source, we got him.
That was bad, but CNN's John King was in good company. Several other news outlets got that wrong, including the AP and Channel 5. Then there was the just plain ugly.
I was told by one of these sources, who was a law enforcement official, that this was a dark-skinned male.
CNN's John King, again citing sources, offended a lot of people with that description. And joining the ugly side, the New York Post, which printed these photos of innocent bystanders.
Those are not the pictures that are going to be released today by the authorities.
And finally, one more bit of nonsense to note. A Boston Herald column claiming the liberal media was upset by cheering and flag waving. Really? Name one. Just one. All right, I really want to start and focus on the good, because you can always nitpick on some of these things and some of the inaccurate reporting, but even the Boston Globe had to acknowledge the local television stations in an editorial this week, just the outstanding job that they did and round the clock. And they were set up. They were in a great position to do it, but then they spread out, they fanned out, they were right on the situation as it started to break later in the week out in Watertown. And as we noted, because you were there too, Phil, people were putting themselves in their harm's way, and people were warning each other on air to duck and that kind of thing. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I have to single out the Boston Globe. Even today, Eric Moskowitz's piece about Danny, the guy who was hijacked and driven around in a harrowing, 90-minute ride with the two suspects. I mean, they got that story. I mean, they had a connection there somehow through Northeastern University, but it was just a terrific story. And a lot of the background profiles the New Yorker, the New York Times have done on the two suspects. The CNN had today this unbelievable story, actually last night, with a first responder from Lynn who tried to save Jane Richards. And they've had one story after another like that, both with the people in the hospital, the people who tried to rescue them. I'm still riveted to it, and that is the good.
It's just been incredible, and it's easy. I mean, this has been a 2-week story at this point, and it's easy to focus on the latest and the Eric Moskowitz story that you mentioned on the guy who was carjacked. It's just jaw-dropping. Yeah. But let's go back a little bit. I'm still kind of in awe of the story that the Globe did on Saturday, right after the arrest, of this incredibly detailed story on the background of the two brothers, and where they even had the time and the resources to pull that together so quickly is incredible. This has been, one of the ways I would look at this is that In 2001, Marty Barron became editor, and almost immediately 9/11 happened, and that became his first big test. And it was really a triumph for him and the Globe. It's a few months into Brian McCrory's editorship. It's kind of the same thing. It's like this is his first big test, and boy, the Globe has really come through. And I want to say, as you did, I don't want to overlook what the TV stations in Boston did, because this is what we do at moments like this, isn't it?
You watch TV.
You watch TV.
Yeah,
and
you're not waiting for the newspaper.
And we were doing it for hour after hour.
One of the greatest advantages of being local is precisely that, being local. Channel 5, 4, all the TV stations were there. They know the territory. When it came down to the coverage out of Watertown, they knew many of the back streets. I was at press conference after press conference with all of these people, with many of these people, Boston Globe, Herald, so on and so forth. And the whole notion of knowing the territory was so key. You knew which questions to ask, and you knew where to go. And the Boston Globe and the television stations
and radio,
including ourselves. Sorry, folks, we can pat ourselves on the back.
Yeah.
The point is that everyone was mobilized, and folks were there. We headed out to all of the locations, our entire staff, and we're short-staffed quite often. The TV stations, as I mentioned before, I was at one press conference. I got there at 3. They had, by the time the press conference started, they had a full complement, about 4 or 5 people from one particular station, if I can point it out, which was Channel 5, your old station.
Yeah.
And so it was. The point is, there was resources that were dedicated to an important breaking story.
I mean, I do feel like we need to move on to some of this middle ground where there's some bad things. I mean, initially, and some of this was understandable, like the confusion over the JFK library fire. That was legitimate. I mean, what are the chances is it separate? Because it was sort of like September 11th again, where at first we were told that the plane crash in Pennsylvania was unrelated, and and then it all starts coming together. So that was understandable.
The fog of war.
Some of the other stuff, what the New York Post did was that was just unconscionable, and they are unrepentant. And they also had a headline that screamed 12 dead. Where did they get that? And they didn't have anybody on the ground here.
Well, I think there's a dynamic to these kinds of things, and in those first several hours, probably the first responsibility of the media, and particularly television media, is to report what you know, because people turn to you for information that will make them safe, or maybe give them information of those people who may not be safe. So at that point, I think the responsibility is, as best you can, put the information out there that you've heard, and with whatever qualifications you need, so that people can digest it and act on it in terms of security. When you get 24 hours, 48 hours away from that event, granted, the alleged assassins, the terrorists, are still on the loose. But still, there was no need for there to be the rush. In fact, you put the public in danger
in custody,
when you say that. And so it went exactly in the opposite way.
Because law enforcement was slow to react to that. They could have nipped that in the bud instantly, and they waited hours.
Yeah, they did. I think what you had there was the sources that John King and the Boston Globe and others were relying on, Channel 5, were their local sources, and those sources were once removed from the people who knew what was going on.
Those were sources in Washington and New York, not local.
Well, we don't know, but why then did NBC, sitting in Washington, D.C., have it right? I think it's because the FBI had the information, and the local sources really didn't, and they were going on the speculation side.
The other way around. But anyway.
Which is interesting, because one of the things that, and of course I'm looking at where information comes from, because from there you derive your credibility. So to your point, when I first heard that, I'm thinking, why isn't the FBI saying? If the FBI is not saying, and they're the head of this thing, I don't understand why I should appreciate that this has happened. I just didn't believe it at the time. And I also thought, the fact that Pete Williams kept saying from the beginning, from NBC, no, no, no. So, I mean, what was disturbing about that for me is that these were 3 institutions I'm mentioning, AP, CNN, and Channel 5, that have our respect and typically are credible sources. So it was very confusing for me, knowing that, thinking, well, what's going on here? Because if you can't trust them for this, that's very unnerving, I think. And then the fact that Pete Williams was absolutely adamant that no, that was not the case, let me know that there was something going on there with the sourcing. I don't know what it was. But here's my point. Once it's clear that you're wrong, I think you need to come out and say immediately you're wrong. Some people are a little slow on that, and I thought that was not appropriate.
I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure that everybody really believed that they were wrong. I think that they felt that their sourcing was so good that they weren't going to back down.
Yeah, but when it became clear that they were wrong, that's my point. When it became clear, then let's put it out there. It took AP a minute to say something. They finally did, with no uncertain terms. It took CNN and John King a long time before they said, okay, well, wait a minute, this is not right. And the whole dark-skinned suspect thing just sends me over the ragged edge.
Especially since they had already they'd already dialed back on that whole Saudi connection. Right. And then, because I think that was the same person they were talking about, and then to take it one step further and describe them when that person had already essentially been discounted.
It just didn't.
I think you're right, though, about the multiple sourcing. This is the terrorism task force. Think about this as a task force. So we're talking with state police, FBI, other agencies, Boston Police. And indeed, we were hearing from different sources, and there was some contradiction because there was one source removed from the main source was Ed and the FBI head in this case. They were the two people who were basically churning through the information. Anything outside of that could, in fact, go wrong.
I don't know. All right.
Well, there's the old saying, those who know don't say, those who say don't know.
That's right.
This was a good rule to follow.
All right.